So that being said, we can finally start to draw the waves themselves, right? So drawing your heart again, or perhaps drawing, I should outline the sequence again. So atrial depolarization, then ventricular depolarization, then ventricular repolarization, right? And we're saying in bracket atrial repolarization is happening somewhere in the midst, but it's not very well or easily seen on the electrocardiogram, right? So let's draw this stuff out. So bam, 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 bam. All right, so we're gonna label all of this stuff and then we're gonna talk about it. So by convention, this is called the P wave. This is called a QRS complex. This is called a T wave. All right, cool. This is the PR interval. This is the PR segment. Okay, this is the ST segment, and this is the QT interval. And finally, this is the RR interval. So don't worry, a bit of a messy diagram, but we're gonna go into much greater detail. Okay, so the first obvious thing or deficit in knowledge is that I have not defined for you waves, intervals, and segments. So let's mix it up. Let's do a little typing. So a wave is any positive or negative deflection on the ECG. Waves have amplitude and duration. Okay, what's a segment? So segments are flat or isoelectric areas on the ECG between two waves. Most commonly, these, right? Okay, so most commonly these are important due to duration and or amplitude. But to be frank, you know, most of the times we don't really speak about the duration of like the ST segment or the PR segment. So I would correct that and say it is most relevant. Segments are most relevant also due to their amplitude. So is it elevated or depressed above the baseline? But the point is, a segment is a flat line in between two waves, basically. All right, and then intervals, these are combinations. Wow, art. Anyway, these are combinations of at least one wave and one segment. Right? So, and intervals mainly are analyzed based on the duration, right? So wow, I'm cooked. All right, one sec. Right, so intervals are important because of their duration. All right, cool. So that's what those are. So we're going to go back to the ECG now, or the ECG diagram. Okay. So the P wave, so let's talk about the waves first. P wave represents atrial depolarization, right? So let's draw a little heart. So the P wave represents depolarization of here. Fine. As you can see, atrial repolarization is not well represented on the ECG. Then the QRS represents ventricular depolarization, right? Which is here. Cool. All right. And then the T wave represents ventricular repolarization. So let's make the ventricle white again to represent repolarization. All right. And by this time, the atrium would also be white again, ready for another impulse to occur. All right. So that's what the waves represent. And we're going to speak about QRS nomenclature very shortly, right? But let's focus on the basic parts of the ECG first. Okay, so let's make this diagram simple and erase a few stuff. So now let's talk about the segments. You have a PR segment and you have a ST segment. Okay, so essentially the PR segment is the period between atrial depolarization and ventricular depolarization, right? So there's a little pause. And the ST segment is the period between ventricular depolarization and ventricular repolarization. So there's a little pause there. All right, that's all it really is. ST, PR, right? Let's go. So the intervals now. So the PR interval is the combination of the P wave, and the PR segment, right? So that's called the PR interval. Why is that important? So this duration, because remember it's X and Y axis, so voltage and time. So this duration is the total duration of atrial activity before the ventricles become activated. So it's how long between when the sinus node starts to fire, which would be the beginning of the P wave approximately, right? So how long does it take for the impulse to reach from here to here, right? So it would be a combination of the time taken for the atria to depolarize as well as the time taken for the hold up in the AV node, because as we described earlier, there's a slight delay in the AV node before the impulse is propagated, right? And then the QT interval, this is the total time. So the QT interval is the total duration of ventricular activity, electrical activity, because the ventricles depolarize and then they repolarize. So how long does it take for the ventricles to do their thing? That's basically what the QT interval is. Okay. And then the RR interval is the duration. So one QR is here, another QR is here. Is the time between two heartbeats, right? Because a heartbeat corresponds with ventricular activity. Okay, so when you feel a patient's pulse, you're not able to palpate or to feel the atrial contraction or the atrial activity. It's the ventricular contraction that pushes blood out of the aorta and into the circulation. So each QRS is analogous with a heartbeat, right? So the RR interval is the time between two heartbeats, okay? Or the time between two complete cycles, okay? Two complete cardiac cycles. All right. So next, briefly, I'd like to speak about the nomenclature of the QRS complex, right? So first, it's called a QRS complex, right? So complex meaning it's a combination of multiple waves, all right? So not all QRS complexes have to have each of these waves, meaning Q wave, R wave, S wave, all right? So this is called a QRS complex. This is called a QRS complex. This is called a QRS complex. So I think for a lot of persons initially there's some confusion about that. So how do we label these waves? How do we know what is what? Well, first thing is first. I think I'll type this one as well. So a Q wave is the first negative deflection in a QRS complex, and R wave is the first positive deflection in a QRS complex, right? And an S wave is any negative deflection after an R wave. Great. So, for example, all right, a Q wave is the first negative deflection, right? Or perhaps I could refine that definition, any negative deflection before an R wave. So for example, that's a Q wave, that's a Q wave, that's a Q wave, all right? And there's other variants. That's a Q wave, right? Great. Anything that's positive is an R wave. So this is an R wave. This is an R wave. This is an R wave. This is an R wave, right? So there's something I wanted to say, it slipped me. But all of these are referred to as QRS complexes, even though they don't necessarily have all the waves. And then any negative deflection after an R wave is an S wave. So this is an S wave, this is an S wave. Alright. Oh, I drew that one already. Alright, whatever. This is an S wave too, to be honest. Alright. So any negative deflection after an R wave is an S wave. Alright, so let's refine this a little bit more. The dominant wave or waves get a capital letter, and the inferior, I guess if you're not dominant, you're inferior, whatever, they get a common letter, right? So and they go in the order of the wave. So for example, let us say I got this. This would be a tiny Q and a big R. If I have something like this, it would be Q R S. Okay. If I have something like this, it would be an R S. So that's how you write them if you want to be 100% accurate, or if you want to be very technical about it. Okay, so in summary, the take-home message I want you to get is that all of these are QRS complexes. Even though this one doesn't have an S wave, this one doesn't have a Q wave, it's still called a QRS complex.